In a room full of laughter, no one expected the janitor to touch the piano and silence the world. A billionaire's party turned into a cruel game. The arrogant host promised his daughter's hand to anyone who could play a piano piece that none had ever mastered. Guests mocked when a black janitor stepped forward, his worn uniform and tired eyes drawing laughter. But as his fingers touched the keys, the air shifted, and history was about to be rewritten. The hall glittered with chandeliers, but pride filled the air more than light. It was the kind of night where wealth wasn't just displayed, it was weaponized. Crystal glasses chimed, diamonds sparkled under the golden glow, and laughter echoed through every corner. But beneath the shimmering gowns and polished shoes lay an unspoken cruelty, a hunger to see others fail. The billionaire who hosted this grand evening had crafted not just a celebration, but a stage for humiliation, a game of pride disguised as a challenge. His words had cut through the air earlier that evening, sharp and boastful. "If any man here can play this piano piece to perfection, I will give him what he desires, even my daughter's hand." He had said it with a smirk, knowing full well the impossibility of his dare. For years, this piece, a complex classical storm of notes, had mocked even the most trained musicians. Scholars had studied it, artists had tried it, and all had failed. Yet still, one after another, guests had attempted, their fingers stumbling across the keys, each mistake met with sneers, each failure a victory for the host's arrogance. The piano itself sat like a throne in the center of the hall, black polished wood gleaming, its silence heavy with challenge. To some it was merely an instrument, to others it was a trap. Each time a guest approached it, the room held its breath in false suspense, secretly rooting for failure so that laughter could follow, and laughter always did. The wealthy heirs with their expensive lessons, the renowned musicians who had once been praised on world stages, all crumbled under the weight of the piece. Their pride cracked like fragile glass with every mistake, and the audience fed on it like vultures. Then, in a moment no one had expected, the janitor stepped forward. His uniform was worn, his shoes dull from years of scrubbing floors that shone for people who never saw him. The whispers spread like fire through the crowd. "The janitor? Is this a joke?" they hissed. "Does he even know what a piano is?" Some covered their mouths to hide their laughter, others pointed openly, delighted at the thought of another humiliation. This one even sweeter because of who dared to try. To them he was invisible. A man who swept their dust and collected their discarded glasses. A man who stood in corners, never noticed, never valued. Yet now, under the piercing gaze of chandeliers and mocking eyes, he was stepping into the light. His walk was steady, though his heart carried a lifetime of silence. The piano wasn't foreign to him. To him, the piano was life itself. He had known music not from lessons in golden halls but from nights in forgotten rooms, where his mother's voice hummed old melodies as she worked to keep food on the table. He had touched broken keys in a church basement, his fingers learning not through theory but through need, through love, through grief. He had poured his loneliness into borrowed instruments, teaching himself not the perfection of sound, but the language of the soul. While others had sought fame and applause, he had sought escape, a way to turn pain into beauty, emptiness into harmony. As he sat before the piano, the room erupted in whispers. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning, confident that this would be the greatest mockery of the night. "Let him try," he said with a wave of his jeweled hand. "Perhaps he'll clean the keys better than he plays them." His words drew cruel laughter from the crowd, but the janitor didn't look at them. His eyes closed for a moment, as if he were listening to something beyond the room, beyond the arrogance. He laid his rough, calloused hands on the keys, and in that touch, the atmosphere shifted. The first note rang, not sharp, not timid, but alive. It didn't sound like a challenge, it sounded like a memory. The melody grew, gentle at first, then swelling, weaving through the silence like a voice, long suppressed, finally being heard. Every note carried weight, a story hidden within. The guests who had been ready to laugh found their lips parting not in ridicule but in disbelief. The janitor's fingers moved not with the mechanical precision of a trained musician, but with something deeper, something truer. His hands were telling a story. The hall, that had once glittered with arrogance, now shimmered with emotion. The chandeliers above reflected in tear-filled eyes, though few admitted it. The janitor's music was not flawless in technique, it was flawless in truth. He played as if every note were a breath, as if the piano had been waiting for him all along. The melody spoke of struggle, of nights filled with hunger and days filled with labor. It spoke of being unseen, unheard, forgotten. It rose like a prayer, then fell like a whisper of sorrow. It climbed again, fierce with determination, then softened into a lullaby of hope. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had come to mock, to revel in another's failure, yet now they felt small, stripped of their pride. The billionaire's smirk began to falter, his fingers tightening around his glass. His daughter, who had once rolled her eyes at her father's cruel games, now sat forward, her gaze fixed on the janitor, her heart stirred by something she couldn't name. The piece built to its storm. Notes cascaded like rain, thunderous and unrelenting, yet within the storm was beauty, raw and untamed. The janitor's eyes glistened, though he never looked away from the keys. The crowd was gone to him, the room was gone. There was only him and the piano, two souls speaking a language no one else had understood until now. When the storm finally broke, the final notes lingered, fragile as glass, soft as a heartbeat. Then, silence, a silence thicker than any laughter, a silence that demanded respect, a silence that no one dared break. For a long moment, no one moved. The chandeliers flickered above, casting their golden glow on faces that looked different now, not proud, not mocking, but humbled. The billionaire's daughter's eyes filled with tears, not from the promise her father had made, but from the realization that greatness could be hidden in the most unexpected places. The janitor slowly lifted his hands from the keys, his chest rising and falling, as if he had laid down a weight he had carried all his life. And then, almost reluctantly, the applause began. Soft at first, uncertain, then growing, building, until the hall thundered with claps and cheers. It was not applause for perfection, it was applause for truth, for the man they had overlooked, for the music that had spoken louder than pride. The billionaire sat frozen, his arrogance shattered. For the first time, he had been silenced. His promise hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. But even as eyes turned to him, expecting him to honor his word, the janitor rose, bowed his head slightly, and began to step away. He had not played for reward, nor for marriage, nor for pride. He had played because the piano had always been his voice, and tonight, for the first time, the world had listened. The billionaire's daughter stood, her voice breaking through the applause. "Wait," she whispered, though her words carried across the hall. The janitor paused, glancing back. Her eyes met his not with pity, not with mockery, but with respect, with something deeper. And in that moment, the hall knew that something had changed forever. Because sometimes, greatness is not in those who shine under chandeliers, but in those who clean beneath them. And sometimes, the most invisible soul plays the most unforgettable song. His rough hands, calloused from years of cleaning floors, found the keys as if they were old friends. The melody flowed, not with perfection, but with soul. Notes danced like whispers of struggle, love, and pain. The laughter stopped. Some wept without knowing why. In that moment he wasn't a janitor, he was a storyteller, pouring decades of silence into sound. The sound itself was unlike anything the hall had ever held before. It was not just music, it was life bleeding through the keys. Each vibration carried echoes of long-forgotten nights, when the world seemed too heavy and survival itself felt like a cruel punishment. He played not as a man trained in concert halls, but as a soul carved by hardship, loneliness, and quiet resilience. His fingers trembled at first, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of memory pressing down on them. And then, as if the piano itself recognized him, they steadied, moving with a grace no one expected from a man whose hands had spent decades gripping mops and scrubbing floors. The audience, once drunk on arrogance and wealth, began to shift. The murmurs of mockery that had filled the room moments ago had died completely, replaced by a silence so heavy it almost pressed against the walls. Eyes that had looked upon him with ridicule now watched as though witnessing something sacred. Some leaned forward, their breaths caught in their throats, afraid that any sound would shatter the fragile miracle unfolding before them. Others felt their hearts stir in ways they could not explain, as if a forgotten wound had suddenly been touched by something both painful and healing. The melody rose, carrying the weight of his story. It spoke of childhood dreams that never reached daylight, of a boy who had once lingered outside music shops, pressing his ear against the glass, yearning to touch what seemed forbidden. It carried the sound of his mother's lullabies, hummed softly as she worked late into the night, stitching clothes to keep the family alive. It carried the ache of loss, the bitter sting of watching opportunities slip through fingers that had never been given a chance to hold them. And yet, beneath all that sorrow, there was light, there was hope, there was beauty carved out of brokenness. Every rise and fall of the notes painted pictures no artist could capture. When the melody swelled, it felt like a storm breaking, the kind that tore down walls of pride and left only truth behind. When it softened, it was like the hush of dawn, a fragile peace that made listeners close their eyes and see memories they thought they had buried. One woman in the crowd wept openly, not knowing why the music hurt her so much. A man beside her clenched his jaw, fighting back tears he didn't want the world to see. Even the billionaire himself, seated like a king on his throne of arrogance, shifted uncomfortably, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of disdain. But inside, something had cracked. The janitor's music was not for them. It was not to impress, nor to win, nor to prove. It was simply the truth of a life lived in shadows, brought into light for the very first time. He did not look up, did not search for their approval. His eyes were closed, lost in the world he was weaving. To him, there was no audience, there was only the piano, his only companion through years of silence, now finally allowed to speak. As the song deepened, the crowd began to feel it in their bones. It was as if the melody pulled at invisible threads tied around their hearts, unraveling pieces they didn't even know existed. The music carried the weight of injustice, of invisible struggles, of a life never given the dignity it deserved. But within the same breath, it carried forgiveness, resilience, and grace. It was not a bitter cry against the world, but a declaration that even the overlooked carried greatness within them. Some of the guests began to glance at each other, guilt shadowing their once proud faces. They had laughed at him, mocked him, dismissed him without a second thought. They had seen only the uniform, the mop, the bowed head of a man serving drinks and cleaning spills. And now, that same man held their souls hostage with nothing more than his music. The contrast was unbearable. Some could not look at him, others could not look away. The melody shifted again, and this time it became a storm. His fingers struck harder, faster, as if every suppressed scream of his life was being unleashed. The room vibrated with the power of it. It was no longer just music, it was a battle cry, a demand to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. The chandeliers above trembled as if in awe, casting fractured light across tear-streaked faces. The billionaire's daughter, once amused by her father's cruel challenge, now sat with her hands clasped to her chest, her heart pounding. She could not understand why, but she felt as though this man's music was reaching into the deepest parts of her soul, speaking truths she had never dared to name. Then, just as suddenly as it had risen, the storm broke. His hand softened, and the piano whispered once more. It was like watching the sea after a hurricane, still trembling with power, yet slowly finding peace. The notes grew tender, fragile, as if he were cradling something precious. He lingered on the final chords, letting them fade like the last rays of sunset. And then, silence. The silence was unbearable. No one dared breathe, no one dared move. The room was frozen, suspended in a moment that felt eternal. The janitor opened his eyes slowly, and for the first time, he looked up. His gaze was not proud, not demanding. It was humble, almost weary, like a man who had given everything he had and asked for nothing in return. His chest rose and fell as if he had laid down a burden too heavy for words, and then, it happened. A single clap, hesitant and unsure, broke the silence. Then another and another. Within seconds, the hall erupted into thunderous applause, louder than it had ever given to any performance before. People rose to their feet, cheering, shouting, clapping until their hands stung. Some wept openly, others hid their tears behind their applause. But none could deny the truth. They had witnessed something greater than wealth, greater than pride. They had witnessed greatness hidden in plain sight. The billionaire himself sat frozen, his glass of wine untouched. His smirk was gone. For the first time in his life, he had no words. His daughter turned to him, her eyes blazing with something he had never seen before, defiance, mixed with awe. She stood, her voice trembling, yet clear as it cut through the applause. "Father," she said, "you made a promise." The crowd fell silent again, all eyes turning to the man who had orchestrated this cruel game. His face paled. He had never imagined anyone would succeed. His promise had been made with arrogance, not sincerity. And now he was trapped by his own pride. The janitor, however, shook his head gently. He stepped back from the piano, his hands falling to his sides. "I did not play for reward," he said softly, his voice rough yet steady. "I played because the music has been waiting to be heard." His words struck deeper than the music itself. The audience, once accustomed to opulence and shallow displays of talent, now found themselves humbled by a man who asked for nothing even after giving everything. The billionaire's daughter's eyes filled with tears. She stepped toward the janitor, ignoring the gasps of the crowd. "Then let me thank you," she whispered. "Not as a prize, not as a bargain, but as a human who has just been reminded of what beauty truly means." And in that moment, the hall was no longer a palace of arrogance. It had become a cathedral of humility, where truth had silenced pride, and music had revealed the soul of a man they had all overlooked. He turned to leave, his figure disappearing into the shadows from which he had come. Yet none would ever forget him, because sometimes, the most powerful voices are born not from those who stand in the spotlight, but from those who have lived their entire lives in silence. And tonight, that silence had spoken louder than anything the world of wealth had ever known. When the final note lingered, the hall stood frozen. Even the billionaire's arrogance trembled before such raw beauty. His daughter's eyes filled with tears, not from the promise of marriage, but from respect for a man society had mocked. The room that once echoed with pride now bowed before humility. Greatness had revealed itself in the most unexpected soul. For several seconds the silence was unbearable. The sound of that last note still lived in the air, vibrating softly like a ghost refusing to leave. No one dared move, as though shifting their bodies would shatter the fragile truth that had just been revealed. The chandeliers glittered above, casting fractured golden light across faces that had turned pale, humbled, and almost reverent. People who had come to laugh, who had prepared themselves for another evening of arrogance and spectacle, now found their hearts shaking in ways they could not explain. The billionaire sat motionless in his chair, his fingers gripping the armrests as if the very earth had been pulled out from beneath him. All his life, he had believed that greatness could be bought, that it came wrapped in titles, wealth, and applause. But what he had just witnessed had destroyed that belief in a single, devastating performance. He could not laugh, could not sneer. For the first time in years, he was silenced. His pride, his armor had cracked. The janitor sat quietly at the piano, his hands resting lightly on the keys as if reluctant to let go. His chest rose and fell heavily, as though he had just poured out a lifetime of secrets, and now he had nothing left to give. He did not look at the audience, nor did he wait for approval. His eyes remained lowered, humble, weary, almost apologetic for daring to show them the truth of who he was. Then, slowly, the applause began. It was hesitant at first, one pair of hands clapping from the far corner, then another, then another. Soon, it spread like fire across the hall until the room thundered with standing ovations, louder and more passionate than anything the guests had ever offered to trained musicians or celebrated performers. The sound was not just applause, it was confession. It was an admission of guilt, of shame, of awe. It was a recognition that they had been blind, and now, for the first time, they were seeing. The janitor stood, bowing his head slightly, though his expression carried no pride. He did not bask in the applause, did not soak in the recognition. His music had not been played for them. It had not been played to win a challenge or to claim a prize. It had been played because it needed to be heard, because silence had suffocated him for too long. And now, having spoken, he was content to return to the shadows from which he came. But the billionaire's daughter could not let him leave so easily. Her eyes, still wet with tears, followed him as he turned away from the piano. In that moment, she saw more clearly than she ever had in her life. All the wealth she had been surrounded by, all the jewels, the grand halls, the elegant suitors, they meant nothing compared to the honesty she had just witnessed. For the first time, she had seen greatness not as something polished and decorated, but as something raw, vulnerable, and real. She stepped forward, her voice breaking through the roaring applause like a gentle bell. Wait. The word was soft, yet it carried across the hall with surprising strength. The janitor paused, his back still turned, his shoulders heavy. Slowly, he turned to face her. Their eyes met, and in hers he saw no mockery, no pity, only respect. The respect he had been denied his entire life. Her father stiffened, his jaw tightening. This was not the outcome he had envisioned when he had set the challenge. He had expected humiliation, laughter, another reminder of his superiority. Instead, he had been forced to watch as the man he had dismissed and ridiculed stole not only the admiration of his guests, but the heart of his daughter. The crowd began to whisper again, though the tone had changed entirely. There was no laughter now, no sneering remarks. The whispers carried awe, confusion, even guilt. Some of the guests looked ashamed, remembering the way they had laughed when the janitor first stepped toward the piano. Others looked inspired, as though their own forgotten dreams had been awakened by the music they had just heard. The janitor's voice, rough and quiet, finally broke the silence. "I didn't play for rewards," he said. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. "I played because the music has been inside me for too long. Tonight, I let it speak." His honesty struck the room harder than the music itself. Many lowered their heads, unable to meet his gaze. The billionaire clenched his fists, but he could not argue. His arrogance, his wealth, his entire identity felt fragile in the presence of a man who had just revealed greatness without asking for anything in return. The daughter took another step forward, her eyes never leaving the janitor's, and yet, she said softly, "You've given us more than music. You've reminded us of something we had forgotten. That beauty doesn't belong to the wealthy. That greatness doesn't wear crowns. That sometimes, the truest voices come from those we never thought to listen to." The crowd fell silent again, her words piercing their hearts. For the first time, many of them began to reflect on their own lives, their own arrogance, their own blindness to the people around them. Some thought of the workers who cleaned their homes, the strangers they passed without greeting, the quiet faces in the background of their lives, and they realized how many stories they had never heard, how many voices they had silenced without even knowing. The janitor lowered his gaze, his face shadowed with humility. He did not argue, did not correct her. He simply bowed his head slightly, as though acknowledging her words without claiming them. To him, the truth of the music was enough. But to her, it was not. She stepped closer, ignoring her father's glare, ignoring the gasps of the crowd. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "not as a prize, not as a challenge, but as a human being who has been reminded tonight of what truly matters." The janitor looked at her, his rough hands hanging awkwardly at his sides. He had never been thanked like this before. Not truly, not with sincerity. For a moment he didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded, his lips pressed tightly together, his eyes glistening though no tears fell. Behind them, the billionaire's mask cracked further. His arrogance was crumbling, piece by piece, replaced by something unfamiliar. He had built his life on pride, on being untouchable, on controlling every room he entered. And now, in his own hall, before his own guests, he had been stripped of that power by a man he had once considered invisible. The humiliation burned him, but deeper than that, a realization gnawed at him. He had been wrong. The guests began to approach the janitor, one by one. They offered handshakes, words of apology, words of admiration. Some could barely look him in the eye, their guilt too heavy. Others spoke earnestly, thanking him for a performance that had touched them in ways they could not explain. He accepted their words quietly, though his expression remained humble, almost detached. For him, the music had never been about them. It had always been about survival, about truth, about finding a voice when the world had none to offer him. As the night wore on, the applause faded into conversations, and the conversations into whispers of change. Some of the guests left that hall different people than they had entered. Some would return to their lives and forget, but others would carry the memory of that night forever, allowing it to shape the way they saw the world. And though the janitor returned to his work the next day, pushing his mop across the same floors, he did so with the quiet knowledge that for one night, the world had listened, and perhaps, in some way it always would, because greatness does not always roar. Sometimes, it whispers through the rough hands of the overlooked, through the weary eyes of the forgotten, through the music of a soul that refuses to remain silent. And when it does, even the proudest hearts must bow. That night, the Billionaire's Hall became more than a monument to wealth. It became the stage for a revelation. That greatness is never where we expect it to be, but always where humility waits patiently in the shadows, ready to step forward when the world is finally ready to listen.